I've got a hand up. Thank you very much indeed. So it means that the people who are online are online. So welcome everyone to this day, quite an important day and a very important piece of work. Can I start by thanking Nuffield, who are here, for sponsoring this event. So thanks very much to you and your colleagues. It's extremely helpful. This is an important piece of work which conveys an enormous amount of complexity in relation to the subject, but I think it's key that we sort of burrow down and try and understand this very, very key piece of work and a key time for public policy in this area. Going to introduce two speakers at the beginning, Richard Brown and Hannah Brinston, and then I'll introduce the panel who are going to spend some time just commenting, giving their views on the research findings, and then I'll open up more widely to the room and also to the people that are online. I'm Stuart Etherington, by the way. I chair the National Centre for Social Research, so they give me jobs like this. Can I introduce, first of all, Richard Brown and then Hannah Brinston. Richard is the Director of Society Views at the National Centre for Social Research, and he was part of the team that did this work. Other members of the team are also here, this very interesting piece of work. And then after Richard has spoken and outlined the findings, Hannah, who's Head of Policy and Advocacy at the Food Foundation, who oversees a portfolio of work in that area, will comment particularly in the area of food policy and food poverty. So can I first of all ask Richard if you'd like to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and very good to be here this morning to launch this piece of work. This is our fourth Society Watch report. Society Watch tries to do something a bit different, tries to draw together research by NatCen with research from other organisations to shine a bit of a light on what's going on in society. And we've done them on mental health, we've done them in the past on the impact of the pandemic on people's lives and their worries. And this year, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're focusing in on the cost of living crisis, which has followed on fast behind so many other pieces of turbulence over the past few years. And I'd like, just before I go further, to thank very much Charles Wilson and Yasmin Begum, the co-authors of the report, and all of our colleagues at NatCen who worked together on it, and also Nuffield Foundation for supporting this morning's event. As I mentioned, the crisis has been one that's evolved over time, and it comes on the background, against a background of quite a turbulent few years. So sometimes disentangling what accounts for what is quite a complex thing to do. So what we've tried to do in the report, what I'm going to try and do in about 10 or 15 minutes now, is just start with looking at pre-existing patterns of poverty and disadvantage, talk about how those changed during the pandemic, talk about the crisis and how the crisis has evolved, talk about how we're responding to it in terms of our behaviours, talk about where you can see it impacting on people's day-to-day lives, and then say some things perhaps necessarily more speculative at this stage about its long-term impacts. And as I mentioned, this draws together NatCen research, particularly from the NatCen panel, our probability-based panel, which reaches parts of the population that other panels can't always reach so effectively. And it also draws on research from ONS, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and some consumer research. The last thing I'd say before I start getting into it is that the surveys we do, the research we do, is necessarily in aggregate. We look at big picture of how different people, of how society is changing. Where we can, we look at how particular groups are affected, but survey methodologies don't always allow us to do that in great detail. And one has to realize that behind each one of these figures, each one of these data points, there's a myriad of individual stories, myriad of lived experiences out there. And I hope during the panel discussion, we can get more into some of that. So, using the standardized definition of poverty, which is a household living in a household with less than 60% of median income after housing costs, poverty rates have been relatively consistent over the past 15 to 20 years. They are as high at the moment, 22%, that's 14.5 million people, as they have been for the past 20 years. But within that, deep poverty, shown there, people living in less than 40% of median income, has it grown within that group of people in poverty? Those are some stats from the JRF. So within the group of people in overall poverty, those in much deeper poverty has grown much faster. Poverty rates are also much higher for different groups. They're higher, as the chart shows, for children. They're high for people living in cities, people in rented accommodation, people with disabilities, and particularly high for some ethnic minority groups. For example, families headed by someone from Bangladeshi, households headed by someone from Bangladeshi heritage have 53% poverty rates. For Pakistani-headed households, that's 49%. For black-headed households, 40%. Whereas for white households, 19%. So some big differences, and those will affect hugely how the pandemic has affected different people. And the pandemic itself had what you might call sort of slightly polarizing impacts. For a lot of people, for all the inconvenience and all the worry, lockdowns were a time when enforced leisure meant people saved money, paid off debts, built up their savings. But for people at the lower end of the income scale, the opposite was true. If anything, they were actually drawing down savings and going further into debt. So coming out of the pandemic, some people have built resilience, but other people have had theirs eroded. And you can see that in that fall in people with financial resilience. Pandemic also saw some changes to health. The number of 17 to 19-year-olds with probable mental health problems rose from 17 to 26% during the course of the pandemic. And we know, in addition, that the number of people economically inactive owing to ill health rose from around 2 million to 2.5 million over the same period. How far that was down to COVID, how far to other factors is still something being explored. So for a lot of people, the pandemic already brought their levels of resilience lower. And the crisis itself, to rehearse it briefly, inflation started breaking the government's target in around 2 years ago in summer 2021, went up to the rest of that year, accelerated after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, peaked at 11.1% in October last year, and has now fallen, but not fallen nearly as fast or as far as people had hoped. And I think something important to say about inflation is it has a differential impact on different people. Because poorer people spend much more on fuel and food, they're much more exposed. And we know that food and non-alcoholic drink inflation is still going up by 18% a year. So in October 22, for example, when the rate was 11.1% overall, it was 12.5% for the poorest 10% of households and 9.6% for the richest. So every time you look at the inflation, it's hitting some people harder than others. And interest rates have been the first line of response to that rising inflation level, coming up since the end of 2021 and up to 5% now and expected to go up further. I think the thing to observe about interest rates is because of they will impact on people with mortgages. As people come off fixed term mortgages, that will become quite a big hit, particularly perhaps for people who got on the housing ladder more recently and are more heavily leveraged in terms of their borrowing. So that probably is a problem that's still unraveling, will unravel more over the coming months. And beyond that, government has, of course, introduced different measures to try to address the rising cost of living. And the crises do almost map onto each other. Even at the end of COVID support schemes, the furlough scheme, the self-employment scheme, and the uplift to universal credit in September, October 21, government was already introducing a household support fund to deal with the rising cost of living. After the invasion of Ukraine, more general measures were brought in on fuel duty and on energy bills. Under Liz Truss's brief premiership, the fuel duty, the energy bill price cap was introduced, and that's been rolled forward to the end of this month at a diminished rate. And that should be that, according to the government, is the end of those support schemes. So you can see how, while support is declining, there's still a high and growing problem there. And how have people responded? This slide shows some of the ONS data on showing how people have responded to the cost of living crisis. The gap there in September 22 is just from a change in the base, so it's worth showing that it's not precisely the same group of people who were asked before and after that. The most common response has been spending less on non-essentials. That's been consistently 70%. And you can see that reflected in consumer data as well. For example, Barclaycard data shows people still spending on food at a bit below inflation, but spending on things like furniture and clothing and eating out dropping quite sharply. Also to note, I think, in this chart is using less fuel has actually fallen even through the winter, showing the government's price support cap was having an impact. And cutting back on non-essential journeys in my vehicle has also fallen as fuel prices have fallen. And obviously there's been a fuel duty discount as well. While we can see what looks like a slight growth in people spending less on food shopping and essentials, it's not that clear. What's most clear, I think, and what's grown really in the last few months is people using their savings, which has grown from 27 to 32% of people. I think, again, we're seeing perhaps people starting to lean into savings and borrowing more. And looking at these data from the NatSen panel research, you can see, I think 63% of regular savers have cut down on their saving habits. And it's the people who were most vulnerable, most in most tricky financial circumstances who've done that most. These charts are based on, they show an odds ratio, relative likelihood of cutting back on savings. So it shows that those people finding it very difficult were 45% more likely than those people living comfortably to say they were cutting back on their savings. And you see the same pattern in terms of arrears. People getting into arrears on household bills, more than 32 times more likely than people living comfortably if they were living, finding life difficult. And in terms of general debt, higher again. So what we can see then is a pattern of people who are already struggling most, having to react most strongly and change their habits most strongly in response to the crisis. And if you look at some of the JRF research, JRF have been doing a cost of living tracker, looking at the some of the more low-income households. They found 40% of households are in arrears now, of those low-income households, and 22% of those households are actually relying on informal lending arrangements, aka loan sharks, etc., to get by. And obviously that is a big challenge for the future, particularly with rising interest rates. Borrowing generally is becoming more widespread. In late 2021, 18% of people said they were borrowing more than a year previously. Now it's 25%. So just as people are drawing on savings and saving less, they're also borrowing more. So how's this affecting day-to-day life? Well, in terms of, people have talked a lot about heating and eating, and I'll touch on both of those now. In terms of people's dietary habits, our research found that 47% of people were eating less fresh fruit and vegetables and meat than before to try and make ends meet. And while that's quite widespread, there's a minority, but a very significant minority, suffering much more hardship. People skipping meals, people running out of food, people going hungry. 8 to 12% of people have done that over the past month in January this year. And Trussell Trust research showed that 1 in 7 had done that, had gone hungry at some stage over the past year. So there is a substantial minority who are being hit really hard here. And you can see that also in the food parcels figures on the right-hand side of this chart, which have gone up by 50% since 2019-20. And a third of those food parcels are going to families with children. You see a similar pattern in terms of heating and energy use. Almost everybody says they've turned heating down or off at some stage. Most people have also reduced electricity use, but a substantial minority, a really surprisingly large minority, I think here, are unable to spend as much as they'd like to on personal hygiene, essentially, unable to use the bath and shower as much as they'd like to, or unable to keep their house warm. 1 in 5 people unable to do that. So, again, a large minority being significantly affected. There's one interesting dog that didn't bark or hasn't barked so far, which I'll just touch on here because we're talking about household expenses. Homelessness levels, whether counted by people seeking help from local authorities or rough sleeping figures, are around where they were in 2019-20. There's not been a big spike. But I think part of the challenge there is there was a moratorium put on evictions during the pandemic. There was the Everybody In program that you might wish we'd continued after the pandemic to get people off the street. So we don't quite know how those will unwind, and we don't know how those will react to rising mortgage costs. But so far, this hasn't, don't want to make light of it, what was already a serious homelessness problem has not become worse during this crisis so far, but that may be to come. And lastly, in terms of how people have been affected, how's people's health been affected? We've asked people for a few years, what they are very or extremely worried about. I think what's interesting there is money worries have are high, but not that much higher. They've stayed high over the past few years. Its mental health concerns and work-life balance concerns have shot up. Perhaps people are feeling more stressed about the economic situation, people feeling more stressed about their own and their family's mental health. So the pandemic is still having a long impact on how people feel about their lives. And alongside this, our polling on life satisfaction shows, some groups becoming significantly more dissatisfied with life. Young middle-aged people, that's gone up from 3% to 7% saying they're very dissatisfied with life. Also, you can see up there figures from the Financial Conduct Authority showing the growth in money worries. And I think that's also being made concrete through a survey of NHS trust leaders, which said they're seeing more people with mental health problems kicked off by money worries, and also a rise in physical conditions actually associated with fuel or food poverty. The last part of our report, which I won't go into in detail here, tries to articulate what some of the longer term impacts might be. We're still in the middle of this crisis. And I think what most stood out for me is the extent to which it's particularly for children that deprivation in terms of food, deprivation in terms of food insecurity, deprivation in terms of poor housing quality and stability has a long-term scarring effect. It has an effect on school attainment, cognitive development, health and life chances. So there's a whole generation who may risk being affected by some of the deprivation going on at the moment. And that, of course, creates long-term problems for everything from the bean country end of public finances and productivity to the less tangible but equally important things such as societal well-being. So just to sum up, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Some people are already very hard hit, and we see that coming through in the figures. But others have shown a level of resilience. But as you see people starting to get more in debt, drawing down savings, stopping savings, I think there are growing challenges. And we're also seeing a situation where this crisis is perhaps more prolonged than we might have hoped 6 months to a year ago. And so there's still quite a lot of trouble in store. How long it will last and what government can do to tackle it, perhaps is the next things for us to discuss. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That was extremely interesting and somewhat depressing. Can I then turn, please, to Hannah, who's going to talk a little bit about the implications of food policy.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation for us to speak today. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to just deep dive a bit into the food elements that have already been touched on. And I will apologise in advance that it's not a more uplifting story, unfortunately. So just to warn you there. So the Food Foundation, for those of you who don't know, is a charity working in the UK on different elements of the food system with a goal really to ensure that healthy food is available for all. And we work across a number of different policy areas to help achieve that, looking particularly at price and affordability of food, appeal of food, so that's the way it's marketed, the way it seems, the way it's the appeal of it, and also what's available to people. And we look at a number of different policy areas related to each of them. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some tracking work that we do at the organisation around cost of food and food insecurity. And then I'm going to go into more detail about a report called Broken Plate that we published last week, which looks at a number of metrics across the food system related to food and kind of where the big challenges lie. Not all of this is specific to the cost of living crisis, but it shows us what the impacts of the current state of affairs could kind of contribute to in the future. So a basic basket of food. We've been doing tracking work on how much a standard basket of food costs from Tesco's. Based on a standard section of food. What we've got there, I think, is a women's basket. And what we can see is that the price of food has gone up by 25% from £43 to £55, which is really quite a lot in terms of real money that people are having to pay, and we track this every month. And I think one of the important things to note about food pricing in particular is that where inflation has been hovering 8-9%, actually food inflation is more than double that. It's just the inflation rate has come down slightly from 19.1 to 18.4, but it's still very, very significant. And I suspect it will take a long time for that to get back down in a way that doesn't impact families on a day-to-day basis. In terms of food insecurity, so we do tracking again through a YouGov survey. We have slight variability in our questions each month, but there's some core questions around food insecurity that we've been looking at. And what you can see is that food insecurity has increased over the last, year, really, 2 years. It's at 17% of households are currently experiencing food insecurity, and that's actually higher in households with children, which is closer to 25%. So this is really worrying that it's so high in a country like England, the UK. We shouldn't be having food insecurity this high, but also that it's worse in families with children. And then I think that sort of the problem doesn't end there. Actually, what we're seeing is food insecurity is much higher in households that are in receipt of benefits, which is a concerning insight into the kind of value of benefits and whether or not they're in line with inflation. I haven't got the graph here, but there's also disparities, as mentioned previously, in different ethnic groups as well in the country, which is also a concern. And then in terms of what is happening in those food insecure households, we're seeing a significant trend of those who are experiencing food insecurity of cutting back on key elements of a healthy diet. So fruit and vegetables and fish as 3 proxy indicators of that. So again, there's an impact on food insecurity in terms of the healthiness. And this is where the long-term kind of considerations and concerns come from in terms of what that's going to look like for population health in the future if this continues. And it's important just when we're talking about price of food, just to reflect that there are a lot of decisions that are kind of going on in the background. Price in itself is a key factor, but there's also lots of other things that people are thinking about when they're making decisions about what to buy, what changes and substitutions they might be making, both in terms of other expenses and the trade-offs that they're having to make around, affording electricity or other demands that they have to pay for, but also things around convenience and their own ability to cook. Sometimes the substitutions that are maybe suggested are not always appropriate if you don't have good cooking facilities, etc., and things like that. So it's important just to recognize when we are talking about food choices, food price, etc., that there are kind of a load of other decisions that are being made sort of in the background to that. So that's our kind of tracking side of what we're doing. Moving then on to the broken plate. So as I said, this is an annual report, similar actually to the report that you've described today, in the sense that we kind of bring together some of our own research, some of it is done by others, and we consolidate it to tell a narrative of what is happening in different elements of the food system. We published the latest one last week, and here are some of the kind of key findings. So firstly, the amount of money that people have to, the proportion of people's salaries that they have to put basically towards food, what you can see is that the most deprived fifth of the population would need to spend 50% of their disposable income to meet the cost of a healthy diet as defined by the government, compared to only 11% in the wealthiest fifth of the population. So we can see there's a really significant sort of difference here in terms of how much people are having to think about the cost of food when they're thinking about the total expenses that they have. Then in terms of the cost of healthy food, so I've already touched on the kind of way that a basket of food is changing, but in terms of healthy food, what we're seeing is that there are bigger increases in the cost of healthy foods, such as fruit and vegetables, compared to foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt, confectionery and things like that. So we're seeing a sharper increase in fruit and vegetables, which in turn is going to have an impact on the quality of the diets in the population. Advertising spend on food. So I've put this in here basically just to demonstrate what we're up against when we're talking about the kind of food that is available to people. There's a significant proportion of the spend that we see is focused on foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt. And it's important kind of on top of the advertising side of things to consider where there's also special offers and things like that. And while special offers on face value can sort of give the perception of good value, there's also evidence that suggests that when you have multi-buy offers and things on unhealthy food, it actually increases impulse purchasing and therefore actually increases the amount of spend, which is actually very unhelpful at the moment when people are, not able to afford a healthy diet and they're sort of being swayed towards unhealthy food. So I've put this here more for kind of context in what we're kind of up against, as it were. In terms of their nutritious food consumption, so the most deprived fifth of adults consume less fruit and vegetables, less oily fish, less dietary fiber than those in the highest quintile. The differences for sort of fats, salt and sugar are less pronounced, but are still there. But you can see the really significant differences in the quality of the diets across the population, which will be contributed to from or by prices and some of the other factors that we've looked at. In terms of then the kind of long-term impact, so sorry, these ones are a little bit small, but I can talk you through them. So basically the long-term impacts of having a poor diet, which can be contributed to by the differences in prices and changes that people are having to make. So in the top one is dental decay. So we know that 1 in 4 children in the lowest economic groups have dental decay by the time they're 5, which is quite a shocking statistic, and that's quite a lot lower in the higher income groups. Diabetes related amputations, this is just a proxy for sort of diabetes. Again, you can see that this increases or decreases, depending which way you look at it. In the lowest income groups, you have much higher figures of diabetes related amputation, again showing some of the health inequalities that come from the dietary inequalities. Children's growth, this is a really interesting one that was actually in the news a couple of weeks ago around the fact more that as a UK population, children are shorter than in other countries. And this is being seen even in the youngest age groups, where typically you wouldn't see the outcomes of like genetic differences and things like that. So there is a concern about the quality of the diets in the population. I don't have much more detail of that, and I think it's an evolving area, but it's an interesting insight into the kind of state of health in this country. And then children's weight as well. So children's weight sort of data is collected quite regularly in this country in reception and year 6. On the whole, what we're seeing is an upwards trend. There is some data that's come out around sort of from COVID that sort of has skewed the data a little bit, but overall we're seeing increasing levels of childhood overweight and obesity, and this is particularly the case in the most deprived income groups. So again, looking at these impacts of the poor diets. And then finally, just on healthy life expectancy. So the difference in life expectancy between the lowest decile and highest decile is 18 years for men and 19 years for women. So that's quite a significant, again, difference. And there's obviously a risk that this could worsen if the impacts of the cost of living crisis on the way people are able to purchase certain foods, if it's not improved. And again, you can see for comparing to the world again, that United Kingdom is actually quite kind of low compared to a number of other countries. Can't quite see which countries are there. Countries in, I think they're mainly Europe. But we're again kind of lagging behind others. So I think this kind of raises questions about the state of food and nutrition in this country. So then in terms of what needs to be done, I'm going to go very quickly over this because I think this will come up in the discussion, but we look at to address the issues that I'm sort of presented today and that we're seeing in the trends. We need to, there's no one solution. We need to look across the board. So we need to make healthier food more affordable. Fundamentally, that will help improve diets for everybody. We need to stop the junk food escalation, and we need to help ensure that, again, people are sort of able to access those healthier foods. We need to invest in children's diets in various kind of parts of society. we need to make it easier to eat sustainably, and we need to look at different elements of the food system about how we can support this, recognizing that there is a system in place and that, you know, one policy is not going to solve the issues. And similarly, there could be knock-on effects of a policy. So for instance, fruit and vegetables does have impacts in other parts of the food system and on producers. So we do need to think about what the full system and what policies are needed to support the population as a whole and the food system as a whole. Very quickly, free school meals is an area that we do a lot of work on as an area to try and help address some of the food insecurity in specific households. Immediately in the immediate term, there's a call to kind of raise this to at least cover families that receive universal credit, because at the moment the threshold is lower than that. But really longer term, looking at reducing stigma and inequalities to just allow or ensure that school food is available for all, to support healthier children, to support learning, to support education attainment, etc. And then Healthy Start is another policy area at the moment that is particularly relevant actually in the cost of living crisis. So Healthy Start is a benefit scheme that's given to pregnant women up until their child is 4 years old from low-income households to support them with buying basics. Currently, uptake is around 60-ish% across the country, varying from, I think, 50-something% to 70% in different constituencies. And we recently did some mapping on this, which is what that slightly distorted UK map shows. But basically, one of the biggest concerns here in relation to the cost of living crisis is that the benefit level hasn't been increased. And this means that Healthy Start vouchers are just not going as far as they need to. And with increasing prices of formula, which a number of families are reliant on, actually the Healthy Start vouchers are not covering a single tin of formula. So just to give you an idea, this isn't really going to be helping families. They need a lot more support than actually what those vouchers are giving. So we're kind of calling for more support to actually increase uptake. It was digitized a couple of years ago, so there was a bit of a drop off of who actually got it as a result of that. So looking to make sure that everyone who is entitled to it gets it, because obviously if 60% are getting it, there's 40% that aren't. Increasing the value and relying of in line with inflation, and also bridging the gap between the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds who start school and would then be entitled to free school meals. There's this kind of 1-year gap, which also doesn't make a huge amount of sense and doesn't provide the protection that we need for families. So the graph at the top is just showing some of our tracking of where formula prices are. And as I say, the Healthy Start allowance doesn't actually cover the cost of any of the formula, and there has been stuff in the news recently showing that prices of formula have increased. And then you have the map at the bottom just shows the tracking around the country. And then finally, just to kind of say, while we again are looking to have government support for food insecurity, also looking at the role that businesses can play, and the Kids Food Guarantee is a set of asks of retailers, and particularly looking at the role that they can play in supporting healthier diets, putting offers on the healthier foods, and really supporting families at a time when we know things are tough for a number of reasons. So just to end, just say thank you to all of our kind of research partners and to the Nuffield Foundation, who have funded a lot of the work that we do on food insecurity. So yes, thank you to all of them, and also to my colleagues. I am actually very new to the Food Foundation and can take very little credit for all of the work that I've just presented. So yeah, also thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. Thank you. And that was a really interesting presentation, not least of which is there were some sort of policy responses to the problem as well. I want to go on to that a bit when we get embroiled in the discussion a bit later on. I'm now going to introduce you to the panel who are going to just reflect on what they've heard and their own experience. I'll introduce them all, and then they'll speak in particular order. Andrea Berry on my immediate left is from Youth Futures Foundation, a foundation I know is supported by unclaimed assets and doing really good work in the area of young people and disadvantaged young people and the employment market, which I think is relevant to this particular discussion. Before that was at Joseph Rowntree. Alex Beer, who's from the now much praised Nuffield Foundation for supporting almost everything that's going on as far as I can see, and who's responsible for delivering on strategic priorities for the foundation. And last but not least, the Right Reverend Paul Butler, who's the Bishop of Durham and who has a particular responsibility for the Church of England lead on children and families, education and refugee matters. So right in the public eye at the moment, is also a member by virtue of being Bishop of the House of Lords. So let me start then with you, Andrea. Just your thoughts on what you've heard.
Hello, does this work? Yeah, great. Thank you. So I think it would be really important to introduce Youth Futures a bit more and as to why we're really interested in this work. So we are the What Works Center for Youth Employment. We do quite a few things. We fund, we provide grants in local areas for people who are really trying to target the employment gap for marginalized young people. We sprung out just before COVID. So we were December 2019, we finally opened an office and then we shut it because it was COVID a few months later. And we have grown quite a bit over that time as our work continues to grow, unfortunately. Our work continues to grow. A really important aspect of our work is evaluation work. So we actually evaluate what works for helping young people get into sustained good employment. And the work I do is in the economics department. So I look at a lot on the local economy, a lot as well as what is working in different local economies that might be better for these, but not what would be better for the others. That makes sense. And one of the biggest programs, again, very much connected to this, is our Connect to Futures Fund, where we're funding partnerships to do local systems change. And one of the big things we've seen from the Connect to Futures Fund and Cost of Living is, one, the groups that work with young people directly in these areas have had a funding issue due to cost of living. So as their own costs increase, but the need continues to grow and it grows substantially. And one of the things that really grows a lot is mental health. And that's something I wouldn't say enjoyed reading in the Society Watch, but I thought was really important to highlight that mental health concerns for young people has grown. We're really interested in 14 to 24-year-olds. It's grown significantly. And we can link that to the increase in economic inactivity for young people, is that they are off because they have poor mental health. And it's not something that's really talked about for young people. And if you think about the current 20 to 24-year-olds, really 18 to 24-year-olds, they've lived through COVID. So they learned at home for a long time. They should have been making transitions in school at the time of COVID, but instead they were worried about the parents having enough money to feed them, the parents having enough money for having a job still, or whether or not they were furloughed, or if they were in the self-employment income support scheme or anything like that. And possibly they were worried about the health aspects of COVID because their carer, their parent was also ill with COVID, a long-term ill with COVID. So you have those aspects that they've been dealing with. And now they're in a new crisis, which is a cost of living crisis. They should be making their transition to full adulthood. So the mental health aspect, I think, is definitely from cost of living, and it's started. So Youth Futures ran a rapid survey for only ethnic minority young people in August of 2022. So really at the beginning of the cost of living crisis. And we could immediately see then that young people, especially from Black households, were already forced to loan their parents money just to pay the rent, get some food in the house. And these were young people who were out of the house already, and they were needing to loan their parents money or move back home to help their parents make rent and make their bills. And that's a substantial shift, because that was only after a couple of months that their parents already needed additional help from their children. And parents don't want to do that. I am a parent. The last thing I want to do is ask my child for things, but needs must. And that's an additional pressure that can happen for some young people in these groups. I also wanted to, again, mention the poor educational attainment. So NatSen did some amazing work for Youth Futures Foundation on the overlaps of marginalization and what that means for your probability of being NEET in the future. They did this work for us, and initially we just thought it would be a piece of work just showing what could be the worst experience of marginalization you could go through. That means you could be neat. But instead, what they produced for us was a risk index, which combines these indicators, these experiences of being neat. And these experiences happen to the young person themselves, but also to their parents. And that to me was really key, of showing things that happen to parents when they're a child has that long-term impact on young people going forward. And we found that most young people in this country had one risk factor for being neat. Some of these risk factors were poor socioeconomic background, parents who have been unemployed, parents or being through the care system, being from certain ethnic minorities backgrounds, loads of indicators, having a limiting disability, as well as poor mental health. And when they clustered, the worst cluster for being neat was poor mental health and having a limiting disability. I think it was a substantial probability of being neat. So when we look at the educational attainment, poor mental health, and then also everything else going on at home for these young people, I think the long-term impact for us, unfortunately, might mean that we'll be very busy in the future because we'll have an increased cohort of young people who will simply be neat. So they'll be not in education, employment, or training, and they'll be there for a long time. And when you're neat or economically inactive for a long time, economic research shows you have a substantial shift in your life cycle, your life chances in the future. You stay unemployed for a long time, your earnings are lower, and your contribution to your household, to the national economy is lower. And the last thing I'll say, because I might be over the time, I never time myself, is if the UK, this is some research we did with PwC last year, if the UK could solve their NEET crisis to just get to German levels, it could add an extra over 30 billion pounds to our economy. So looking at how the cost of living is not just people affording food, it's these long-term impacts on young people who have no choice, if I can just say it, they have no choice but to be at home when their parents can't afford food for them. That has very long-term impacts for their employment and essentially their entire life. So I think that's what I'll respond to now before I go into an exceedingly rant on what this means for them. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'll turn straight to you, Alex.
Thank you. Just as I drop all my papers on the floor.
Yes, timing issue, really.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. And thanks to Richard and Hannah for some really stimulating presentations, but ones with sort of really difficult messages underpinning them. And thanks as well to the teams behind Society Watch and the Broken Plate for providing such vital insights. So thank you, Stuart, for introducing me. Yeah, I'm Alex Beer from the Nuffield Foundation. And yeah, we'd like to tell you a little bit about the Nuffield Foundation as well. We're an independent charitable trust, and we fund research in the areas of education, welfare, and justice, with the aims of influencing policy and practice with the hope of making a difference to people's lives. So at any one time, we've got about 200 grants underway. And so I'm going to draw on some of these for my remarks. Richard talked at the start about poverty and the money coming into people's homes. And I'd like to sort of break that up a little bit, because the money comes from two places, predominantly for most people, from their wages and from benefit income that they might receive. And so what research from the Resolution Foundation and the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE and their sort of publication Stagnation Nation shows, really highlights the problem of stagnant real wage growth. It was at 33% per decade from 1970 to 2007 on average, and it fell to below zero in the 2010s. So people haven't been seeing their wages growing. I mean, within that, we've got the success of the minimum wage, which has sort of raised the wage floor, but that's not a brilliant tool for reducing levels of poverty, because it depends on the hours that people work, and not all minimum wage workers are actually in poor households. And so there are lots of people who don't get all their income from their labour market, And so one big example is pensioners. So 62% of pensioners get over half their income from the state pension or other benefits. And working age households in the bottom fifth of the income distribution get just over half their income from the labour market. So the remaining, just under half from the benefit system. And single parents, those with the disabilities, those of Bangladeshi origin, notable groups, which are more than twice as likely to be in a household where the minority of income comes from the labour market. And so, when we're thinking about things that we might do to improve sort of people's circumstances, the way benefits are uprated is key. So, for pensioners, I was really struck in the report that it seemed that people in sort of middle ages, were really, really feeling the pinch the most, were worrying the most. And it made me think about whether, the triple lock, improved private pensions, reductions in pensioner poverty has actually been really, really protective for older age groups. Whereas for those on working age benefits, unemployment benefits are completely decoupled from the income levels of the rest of society. So, equivalent to about 13% of average weekly pay. The generosity of disability and ill health related benefits has not increased. And so we've got a great piece of research ongoing about benefit changes and larger families. And larger families are particularly affected. So not only by the low levels of benefits, but also by the introduction of the benefit cap and the two-child limit. So you've got really, really high levels of poverty amongst families with 3 or more children. It means they've got less money, less ability to afford the fundamental building blocks of life, and reducing the possibilities of participating in society. So sort of larger families and the benefit system is it's got loads of sort of participatory research. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to speak the words of Melissa. She's got 4 kids and she's capped by £210 a month, and she misses out on a further £237 a month through the 2-child limit. It does have a bit of an impact on us. Yeah, because obviously, like when you're not getting nothing really for her, I'm paying it out of my other child's money. They don't really get many days out like a lot of kids do, because I simply don't have the money. Sometimes my son wants to go to a football club after school and that, but yeah, it's just affording it like. So sometimes he'll come out of school and say, Mum, can I go to that? And I'll just say to him, well, I'll see if I can afford it, or I can't really afford it right now. And he has a little huff, but then he's all right about it. He forgets about it by the time we get out the playground kind of thing. And it's great to hear it's all right about it, but that's a really sort of difficult set of choices that mum has to make. And low incomes are impacting on mental health. They're impacting on sort of financial resilience. And there are plenty of examples from the work that we support and from elsewhere about the really, really hard work of managing on low incomes. Shopping, having to shop around, having to go without, having to make difficult choices. And another aspect that just hasn't been mentioned is digital inclusion. So actually, I think, Hanny, so you did touch about how that scheme had shifted to being sort of an online one. But we've got a team led by Simeon Yates at Liverpool, looking at minimum digital living standards. And what we're finding through that is the cost of living is putting greater risk of sort of digital exclusion, risks of people sort of stopping their broadband contacts, removing themselves for data, which really will affect them, access to get services that they might need, or access or ability to participate in society. And then I was also struck in the report, which if you read, about people's inability to make a difference. And there's a little bit which shows that people aren't changing their working patterns that much, because you think one response to low incomes might be to, increase the number of hours you work, or increase the sort of jobs. I mean, firstly, you've got to look at the situation of the labour market, where people live. But it might also be driven, some of our research might sort of suggest, by the uncertainty of change, and how additional hours might actually affect the benefits that people receive, or whether a different job might provide the flexibility that someone's accrued in their current role. So yeah, this is all really quite stark. And I've sort of been thinking about, right, well, what do you do? And I think not only do we need to sort of think about how might we improve the incomes and the services and the supports to individuals, but we need macroeconomic policy as well to make all of that work. It's, got the huge, big challenge of bringing inflation down, interest rates, is a fairly limited tool, or possibly about to have a much bigger bite than it has been doing so far. What might competition policy do to bring prices down? And then, how might you actually grow the economy? And so here I'd like to give a plug for the Economy 2030 inquiry being led by Resolution Foundation and Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE. And they're talking about, how productivity growth is an essential prerequisite for raising wages and how you might do that, but also how you need to combine growth with action on employment, pay and benefits, so that you're directly connecting the level of working age benefits to wage growth, just as Britain does for pensioners, and you've got housing support and wider public services to consider as well. But I'll stop there for now.
Thanks very much indeed, Clara. And I'm glad people are reflecting not only on the nature of the problem, but also on the potential solutions that might be there. Paul, can I turn to you?
So thank you for inviting me to take part. That's the first thing to say. And there's always the perils of being the last one. So I'm going to try not to repeat anything that's already been said, but highlight one or two things. One of the things that has become really obvious through a number of reports, including this one, is that in-work poverty is much the biggest issue now. It's not those who are out of work do face serious problems, but it's the in-work poverty. Now, the significance of that is that the entire universal credit system was built on incentives to move into work because work was the way out of poverty. But that's not working. So there's that's one of the things that we have to look, and it's not working largely because the salary levels are inadequate, or the caps mean that the benefit gets taken away. So actually not. So there are reforms that needed around how universal credit works quite significantly, as well as the levels of benefit needing to be tied, I think, to inflation in some way. The second, so I'm unashamedly now going to plug a report that I co-chaired, which came out at the end of April.
It wasn't sponsored by Nuffield, was it?
No, it wasn't. So this is Love Matters. So this is Love Matters. It's the report. It was the Archbishop's Commission on Families and Households, which was 2 years of work with a group of commissioners. And the thing that we highlighted around families and households that came out of that research is something that hasn't really been mentioned, and that is relationship poverty. And one of the really big things that came up in ours was families and households saying, when our relationships aren't working well, then actually that's when we really have problems. That's is the biggest contributor to mental health well-being. It's not, it's actually because our relationships are bad. Now, it's a circle, because actually if there are money worries, very often that means that somebody's trying to do more work. They're not at home, so they don't see each other. The relationships and you get into a circle. So, so I think factor in as well the whole issue of how are we supporting and encouraging relationships. And one of those things, interesting, I love what you've done with the broken plate and so on. But it's not just what we eat, it's how we eat and who we eat with. And when we eat, do we eat together? Actually, if we eat together, our relationships are better. So there's all kinds of factors around and that I think also need to be factored into the consideration of where we go to the future. And it's the poorest, of course, who are hit hardest of not having the time to be with their children or with their partner or with their whatever, because they are working extra hours in order to make a decent living. So I endorse actually everything that's been said by my two predecessors in terms of comments, because I would have said something that I didn't want to repeat them. So the final thing I'd want to throw in is in terms of solutions is JRF and Trussell Trust have worked on this called the Essentials Guarantee, which I think is a really solid proposal of how you work out what is a really basic minimum for someone to live with. And it's done through JRF's kind of intensive research and Trussell Trust's on the ground experience of running the food banks. I chair something also called the Church Works Commission, which has all the major denominations working together on engaging practically on the ground, and the three things that we identified 18 months ago that should be the priorities post-COVID. Number one was mental health and well-being, particularly amongst the young. And we've tied into that the importance of social prescribing as one of the responses. We are the people behind Warm Welcome. That's not widely known, but it started as a tiny little proposal by a few church leaders, but actually brought in the libraries, the theatres, and so on, and it will carry on. The reason it will carry on, we didn't want to establish something like, I want food banks to be abolished because I don't want them to be there. And we were worried about warm spaces potentially doing the same. The reason that those who provided have decided we should carry on into next winter is the research we've done is the main reason people came was not the fuel and heating crisis. It was the loneliness crisis. The main reason people attended warm spaces was because they got company. There are lots of things on the ground that do that, but then you have to have the macro and you have to have the policy decisions as well. There you go.
Thanks very much indeed, Bob. You touch, I think, on a really interesting point, which is the way in which all of these issues related to poverty, etc., relate to human relationships and social contact. Struck by the warm spaces example, I think the non-profit sector has many examples of where they try and do this. A classic is park run. So people go to this. It's nothing to do with running. It's to do with the personal relationships that are opened up as virtue of doing that. I throw that out as an example. But
Except park run is largely middle class.
Yes, exactly.
And
yeah,
doesn't
you're right.
the poor. But you're absolutely right. People do they
So
go for the social contact.
What you may need is ways of bringing people together, which address inequality as well as the other more fundamental issues like income support, etc., etc. I'm going to open it up in a minute, but I get the benefit of asking the first point, which I suppose people have touched on already. I wanted to get people to reflect a little on, given this, I mean, it's a really complex set of issues that we're confronting. It's not going in the right direction. It's going in the wrong direction. And I wondered, there's clearly no magic bullet to confront this range of issues that are there. But perhaps the panel would like to reflect a little on, and some of you have done this already, on what would be the elements of, if you were in government tomorrow, what would be your major priorities in public policy terms for what would you say are, maybe my 2 or 3 things that are must-dos for me as somebody who's going to have responsibility for dealing with this? What would you do? Anybody? Yeah, we go.
So I'd abolish the 2-child limit, and I'd raise benefit levels to where they should. Actually, the first benefit I would do would be restore child benefit to its equivalent original value. Because that's universal, actually, but then also the other benefits. Those would be and I don't know how practical this would be, and I'd be interested, Hannah, what do you think? I would find a way of encouraging all our farmers to produce more fresh fruit and vegetables in this country and nearby, and ensure that they were the best value food that you could purchase when you went to the supermarket.
Right, two very important things. Other people, yeah.
Next.
Yeah, do.
So I think the point that you're making there actually about the producers is really important in kind of what I think I alluded to already, that if you try and reduce the fruit and vegetables at a retail level, you then just kind of push the prices later on. But I think that needs government support for producers to be able to produce what you're saying. But I think making sure that we have more adequate and healthy food in the supply chain so that we can kind of have more affordable healthy food would be important. I think free school meals for us is a really key area. And actually touching on your point around relationships, I think there is a huge relationship aspect to that for the school children to be able to sit down and have a good meal together is really important part of a school day to support, you know, mental health, well-being, to support education attainment, and to ensure that they're getting adequate sort of nutrition, sort of not regardless, but kind of regardless to what else is going on. So I think free school meals is really important. And this is why we kind of saying in the short term, it needs to at least be extended to the universal credit level, but actually there would be a huge amount of value for society as a whole if it was available for everybody at school.
Thank you. We might as well come this way, yeah.
and that said, of course, is independent. So this is the personal opinion. But just to echo these points, and someone asked me earlier today whether there's any good news in this report, and I had to say, well, you have to search quite hard. There's some in a very small paragraph about halfway through. Something I did see on the way up today is that school performance by international standards and educational performance in the UK has significantly improved over past years. Our position in tables like PISA and PIAAC, the international comparisons, it's an undersung success story. But if we don't actually invest in making sure that children don't go to school hungry and that their parents give them the support they need, we're going to slip back. So we really just should avoid throwing away something that, with the change in the economy, with the rise in AI, et cetera, a whole other topic, we need to have a bright, highly educated, highly literate, highly numerate population. That's the foundation of greater productivity. So we should avoid shooting ourselves in the foot and actually throwing away something that actually looks like a success for this country by leaving children to be deprived.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, my top one would probably be removing the 2-child limit, you know, as something sort of pretty pragmatic that you can do straight away. And then sort of additionally, I spoke about the need for, you know, economic stability and growth as a fundamental underpinnings, but you know, that's a bit more difficult to deliver in the short term. And then, you know, I'm not sure where I would sort of then put this on the list of overall priorities that we've identified, but you know, we have, you know, the transition to net zero. And so that is one thing I sort of didn't speak about as I was in my remarks. You know, we need to make fundamental changes to the way in which we live in order to meet the net zero targets, and the way in which the impacts are going to be distributed are going to fall, you know, at risk of falling incredibly sort of unequally. And, you know, so I think, you know, is we need to, you know, give sort of huge thoughts to, you know, the vulnerabilities and capabilities of families and different communities across the country and their ability to transition to net zero. And the Institute for Community Studies has got some great work forthcoming on this. But I mean, you know, one very pragmatic thing, you know, that you might do to support with the net zero transition and to improve housing quality. And, you know, another thing that I think is potentially touched on, but you know, we could have a whole other session on, you know, insulating the walls. You know, the poorest are most likely to have inefficient walls, you know, least likely to be able to pay for improvements to their housing. You know, so how might you improve the quality and the warmth of housing that people have? So potentially reducing their costs.
I think I'm going to take it slightly differently. So, you know, YouFutures, we're really interested in local policies and local solutions. So I think one thing, if we recognize that even if we change policies immediately, there will still be a cohort of young people who would have missed out are currently, the structurally the furthest away from really good life choices in life chances. I would, if we know who they are in schools, I would just target them. I would target them with every bit of support necessary to improve their chances. And so Youth Futures has done, we've just put together a youth employment toolkit that actually just looks at what are the best ways, interventions that you can use to put young people in good employment. So mentoring is one, apprenticeships, et cetera. And it kind of ranks them based on impact and cost. And I think from that, I would suggest I would throw as many good apprenticeships at these young people as possible, because they have one of the best outcomes for young people who finish an apprenticeship. It's a very good outcome for them. So if I see a group of 13 and 14-year-olds who unfortunately their parents are in low economic background, they can't, their parents may not speak English. They may not be able to help them very well with their transition. They're also struggling with cost of living at the same time. If I had that data, I would target them with as much support as possible, because for me, that's how you help the cohort who in a way wouldn't necessarily benefit from increasing benefits immediately. They wouldn't necessarily benefit from two-child limit going away, because they're almost at that age where they're ready to leave the household and the damage has already been done. So I would target that. And I would also look at it very locally as well, because some areas of the country would have more of those young people than others, and the support would look very different. So the support in the Northeast would look very different from London. Just the second thing I would do at the same time is I would unfortunately have to start looking at young people currently in the workplace who are in very bad jobs because they needed to find work for cost of living reasons. So again, part of our survey, we found that young people were changing their goals. Only 2 months after the cost of living crisis, they were already changing their goals for the future because they couldn't afford food or fuel. So I would start targeting those young people who probably have dropped out of uni and have found work. They're working a low paid job and they're stuck. So I would work with employers to improve those jobs immediately. And I also target the young people who might fall into the same trap. So
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks. If I had my sixpence, I'd just abandon GDP as a measure of anything that goes on in a society and come up with a different index that reflected some of these well-being things that we're talking about. If we constantly talk about economic growth as the only solution, I think we're a bit stuck. But that's just my view, so it counts for nothing. So going to open it up now for people in the audience. We've also got people online, but I'll take people in the room first, and then I'll come back to Katie, who's monitoring what people are saying online. So there are mics and people with mics. So yeah, I know that's someone with a mic. Yes, yes, sir. If you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be really, really helpful.
Thank you. It's slightly embarrassing because I'm also from the Nuffield Foundation, but there's no more of us here, I don't think. So my name's Mark Thanks. I'm the Director of Welfare at Nuffield. I'm delighted to be supporting this event, but also some of the research that's been spoken about. My question is prompted by the whole discussion, but in specifically one of Hannah's slides, which showed very high food poverty rates among people with under universal credit, which is hugely worrying and suggests the system isn't doing what it needs to do. But nevertheless, there are also some people receiving universal credit who aren't reporting food poverty. And is there anything we can learn from the circumstances of the people who aren't currently in poverty on universal credit that could help us to reform the system for those who are?
Thank you. Anybody want to have a go at that one? Yeah,
I'll give you two factors that the big figures don't show. Disability, particularly if there's more than one disability, either amongst the children or the adults, that has a massive impact, and they're not getting so they're much more likely to have food poverty. And the other will be the number of children. So that's back to the two-child limit, that it's the families that got 3, 4 children who will be suffering a lot more.
thanks. Anybody else want to chip in on that one?
No, but just to follow up on the point around disability, I think that's a really important point, and it's something that we're doing some work on at the Food Foundation at the moment, looking at disability and food insecurity. And in our latest YouGov survey, where we're looking at food insecurity, which we've just been out on, we'll have the data in the next few weeks. We've asked some more detailed questions specifically on that disability angle. So that will also, based on your theory that that's a key contributor, and that is likely to be the case, we're actually going to have a little bit more in-depth understanding specifically on people who have disabilities.
Thanks very much. Anybody else? Or I'll go back to the room. Okay, anybody else in the room? Yes, sir.
Hello, Paul Dinsdale, health writer and editor. With the government's drive towards net zero targets, there's been quite a lot of research that shows that poorer people on low incomes will be disproportionately affected by having to make a lot of the changes to their lives. For example, heat pumps in houses, which will cost between 5,000 and 10,000, I think. Just interested in what the panel thinks about that. Is it fair to ask people on low incomes to make those sort of changes when they're struggling from day to day on low incomes?
Thank you. Would you like to, as you mentioned, net zero, I think it's.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that I was making would be that, you know, support would be needed for those in the lowest sort of income groups to be able to make the transition. And I think that, yeah, and this is informed by the work that the Institute for Community Studies are doing, you know, the sort of the vulnerabilities that you know, different families and different communities face. You know, so some are, you know, hugely related to income, but also to tenure type, also to sort of local knowledge and sort of skills in the community. And so you really need to take a sort of multifaceted approach to sort of respond to those sets of sort of capabilities and vulnerabilities. But ultimately, in response to your question, I think it needs to come down to you know, financial support and schemes that enable those lowest income families to make the transition.
Thank you.
Could I just add something?
Yeah,
there?
please do. Yeah.
I think one of the complexities on this as well is the growth in private renting or the growth in poverty among private renting people and the growth in private renting among poor people. That I think there are things that local authorities and housing associations could do at scale on heat pumps, etc. But there's a really difficult issue of how you incentivize private landlords to put in insulation, heat pumps, etc., without just passing that on in rent and making a bad situation worse. So there's a nut to crack there, and it may be about subsidy, but it may also be about regulation, I think.
A lot of people are leaving the private rented sector for that very fact because they won't be able to afford to change. So that's going to create further housing problem. I think the big thing is we mustn't make the poorest feel guilty about net zero because they contribute least towards the problem. It's those of us who have higher incomes and do fly in planes and also and its industry and so on. So they mustn't be made to feel guilty about the net zero.
Okay, I'm going to take one more from Steve. Two more. I'm going to take two more, and then I'm going to see what's happening online. Steve.
Steve West, NatSen trustee. The international aspect, I'd be interested to know whether there is or any commissioned work on the international aspects of this, and whether the UK has got anything to learn from what other countries are doing, particularly comparable economies.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a go at this one. So I think in Stagnation Nation, which is the resolution and LSE report I mentioned earlier, they do some interesting comparisons about the sort of different income levels of sort of different groups of the population. And what is stark is that the bottom fifth of the UK's income distribution is much poorer than the bottom fifth of, you know, the of people in the French income distribution. So firstly, you know, our poorer is the message that I take from that. And then I think looking at it from the sort of other end of the telescope, the UK has faced a particularly toxic combination of factors that has led to much higher inflation here than elsewhere. So we've had the tight labour market, which has been a feature of both the sort of UK and the US economies. We've had supply chain bottlenecks. The pandemic is one cause of those, but another cause of those is Brexit. We've had sort of the impact of government activity on the value of the pound. Fuel prices have been an issue in both UK and Europe, but I saw a really fascinating graph the other day about the effects of the Ofgem pricing mechanism, which sort of meant that fuel inflation in the UK persisted for much longer. And so we've had both some factors that the US have had, both and some factors that the EU have had, but we're the only place that had them together, and that's been sort of exacerbated by Brexit. So I think the situation is probably particularly acute here, but I'm sure there remain. So I'm not coming with lessons. I'm just saying things are bad, and I wonder if anyone else on the panel can identify lessons from other countries in response. Oh, yes, please, Andrea. I'm just thinking, benefit levels are much higher in Europe, and you've sort of got wage unemployment benefits that are close to wage replacement levels. So, that have also protected poorer families.
I was just going to make a point about why countries like the UK would be harder hit. And if we just look at the structure of the economy to begin with, so the UK has a high proportion of people who are in what we would consider low paid work. Some other countries in Europe, like Germany, for example, their young people simply do not have the same outcomes that our young people have here in the UK. So I think when you start from an economy that might be less diverse, it's not as diversified as an economy, and you have a macroeconomic shock that really hits the big aspect of your economy, you will be hit worse compared to other countries that might be more primed to adapt because their economy is more diversified. So I think if that's one thing to really take from it, is that the UK as an economy is just structured slightly differently than other countries. And unfortunately, coming out of Europe has not helped that, if you could say that. So I would be the one thing I would take from it.
Okay, yeah, yes, you had your hand up, yeah. The mic on the right.
Hi, I'm Avery Annapol from The Conversation. I wanted to ask a bit more about the role of food aid in combating some of these issues, especially when it comes to access to fresh food. I was struck by the 3 million food parcels distributed by the Trussell Trust last year. And I just wanted to ask where food aid, like food banks and the Trussell Trust, are limited, and where they can be improved for some of these issues.
I think that's definitely for you.
So I think food banks are a really interesting one. I think they're serving a hugely important role right now, but I think we have to be very careful not to make food banks the goal. They're a plaster on what is clearly a bigger issue in society. So I think when we talk about food banks, we have to be really careful there. And I know there's been a lot of concern about what's available in food banks in terms of the quality of the food, but also whether there's enough food, both because more people are using food banks, maybe less people are donating because the people who are donating their own sort of purchases are getting tightened and things like that. So I think not really answering your question, but I think they're playing a really important role, but we do need to think about the sort of the longer term sort of solutions, and you've kind of already touched on that.
And I think there's really interesting developments around things, food pantries, community shops, and so on, which help people have the dignity of paying, but not paying too much. And it helps actually with the fresh food bit a bit, because if they're set up slightly more effectively to be able to store fresh food well, so it doesn't, the food banks have a real problem with fresh stuff. It's got to go out basically the day it arrives. So I think we will see, I suspect we will see a major development around community shops, food pantries over the next few years.
Please do. Yeah.
I guess this is some international development learning that can be attached to this. So just some background, part of my postdoc was actually in international development where we were looking at social assistance programs across the world. And the programs we found that worked the best were the ones that just gave people money. And it sounds really simple, but if you give people money, they know exactly what they need to do with it. And you wouldn't need a food bank in the first place. And this is evidence across South Africa, parts of South America. The biggest poverty alleviation for those countries was just giving people money. And in fact, that was the name of the book that came out of this work, was just give the people the money. And you could see this with the same with free school meals at the time during COVID. I know I was at Joseph Rowntree Foundation at the time, and we talked about that quite a bit, that if people wouldn't have to worry about the parcel they're receiving from the school, if they just had the money to buy their own food in the first place. And that should be the big target, is to make sure people have money rather than needing to worry about if they can get a voucher to go to a food bank.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to the room, but I'm going to give people who are online the opportunity to put their questions. Katie.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. So we've got quite a few questions online. I'm going to pick up.
Just a couple, yeah.
Sorry, can you
Give us
hear
a
me?
couple.
Yeah. So there is one that follows on from the fresh food element. So I'll kind of wrap these in one question, but a comment was made that it wasn't really about the farmers needing encouraging to grow more fresh food, because the current fruit and veg is left rotting because supermarkets aren't paying enough, or there's a lack of labour. And there's also the commercial pressures from the big four supermarkets. So how do we improve nutrition whilst we have to battle those issues? I don't know if that might be for Hannah or
Anybody who wants to pick it
Yeah.
up? Yeah, Hannah,
Well, I can pick that up. So I think this is absolutely why we need government intervention, but on the wider food system, the wider food supply chain, and that while nutrition and health and some benefits and all of these components are all really important considerations, actually there are some questions that need to sort of focus on that food supply chain and how we improve that. And there have been a couple of things over the last few weeks where there have been discussions on this. We're yet to see what the outcomes will be, but there is certainly a recognition that something needs to change. And as I say, whether that actually comes to anything, I don't know yet, but it's really important that we are looking at that.
I mean, the key supply chain issues, aren't they, really? You know, who's controlling the movement here? And yeah. Take one more, Kate, and I'll come back to the room.
Okay, the second popular point was around housing. So the lack of affordable housing hasn't really been discussed that much. We've talked about the rented sector. And so Emma Heath has asked, is there a sense of fatalism around this, or is it just too big a problem to fix?
Yeah, I mean, the research said some interesting stuff about housing, didn't it? So do you want to come back on?
Yes, I mean, we know that housing unaffordability, housing quality and housing instability, particularly housing instability, having to move often and being in the sort of circumstances where you end up in temporary accommodation because you're statutorily homeless, is a big factor in health issues, because a lot of that's poor quality and damp, and is a big factor in terms of educational development for children. More widely, I mean, one of the things that's noticeable, and it's quite an interregional difference, is the difference in poverty rates before housing costs and after housing costs, which is particularly extreme. It's difficult to compare because London's a city and a region, but it's particularly extreme in London and other urban areas where housing costs increasingly. We saw food costs taking 50% of income, I think there. Housing costs are coming up with 30 to 40% for a lot of people in private rent accommodation. So there is a huge housing affordability problem. I mean, there are things that can be done in terms of grant levels to get more affordable housing built, in terms of subsidising more council house building, etc. I mean, I think there are also things in the market that's still challenging. That sorry, housing is something I've written reports about for other employers. The trouble with housing is it's another silver bullet risk. Is we do need more housing supply. We need more housing supply at all levels to actually bring more housing forward. We also need to focus on how we make affordable housing more affordable. So there's macro things just about housing supply, which is still far slower than it needs to be for our population, but also about the subsidy levels, how much we put in to actually make sure that sub-market housing can still work. The challenge is it's that gap between sub-market and full market housing, which is very difficult. It's people moving on from social rented housing, being able to find somewhere in, for example, the private rented sector that isn't too unaffordable. So it's a huge nut to crack, and I think the political focus it's getting now from both parties as part of the productivity as well as well-being crisis is really important. But we've let it drift for a long time, and we've been seduced by too many headlines about, hooray, house prices going up more.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to come back to the room now, and I think a lady over here, you had your hand up. Is there a mic on the way? Thanks. Just down here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name's Nicole Griffiths. I'm a Green Party councillor in Lambeth, just across the river. And I was really struck by your suggestion that if the panelists were in government tomorrow, what they would do. And I wanted to ask them how they felt about universal basic income. Andrew already mentioned that actually we need to put money in people's pockets, and when they have that money, they would choose how to spend it, and they will spend it wisely. I just wanted to make that point. So what do panelists think about the introduction of universal basic income?
Yeah, UBI, where are you on this?
And my other question, if you don't
Oh,
mind,
yeah, no,
is I just want to, because social housing at truly affordable rents is essential, but also that housing needs to be retrofitted, insulated to passive house standard at the very least. And if we're able to do that, and if the government was to provide the funding to retrofit and insulate all of our council homes, especially here in London, it would instantly remove that pressure that we're putting on individuals to reach net zero by themselves. If we retrofit homes, we reduce energy bills, and we introduce truly affordable, reliable, carbon-free transport, it's going to make a massive, massive difference.
Thanks very much.
So, thank you very much.
Let's have a go at the UBI question first, shall we?
We've got an interesting experiment actually at the moment going on in Jarrow in the northeast, where they're experimenting a little bit with UBI. In principle, I'm a fan of it. The difficulty, I think, at the moment is the research comes from much smaller nations. And how does it translate into a nation of 65, 70 million compared with Finland, for example, of 5 million? And when you do the multiplication, it doesn't quite add up. So my suspicion is that UBI will come, but I think it will be in about 10 to 15 years' time when we've worked out how to best do it in a much larger economy. I'll go on the second one. My son and daughter-in-law have bought an ex-London County Council flat in Bethnal Green, wanted to go completely green and couldn't, because they were told the only way it could happen would be for the whole block to be done at once. And there was no mechanism for the whole block to be done. So I agree with you that somehow we've got to change the regulations around how that could happen.
Thank you. On UBI.
Can I just say something about UBI? So this is not a U Futures stance. We actually don't have one on UBI. So I'm just going to turn my thing up. I'm not from U Futures. I'm just Andrea, an economist thinking about UBI. And I think if you, I've been thinking about UBI for a while, personally. And I think a few things would need to happen for the British economy for that to work. First, you would need an economy that does not rely on low paid work for UBI to work. It's not, UBI shouldn't be something that is your long-term solution for the ills of a poverty-stricken economy, quite frankly. You can't just use UBI to get people out of poverty. There have to be other things that happen in your country first. And I'm going to have to say the other thing is the immigration system will have to change, because currently people who come to this country, including me, cannot access public funds until they've been here for almost 5 to 10 years. So if you have a UBI system, if you have an increase in benefit system, you have to make sure that people who possibly needed the most. When you have poverty data, when I was at JRF, showing that people who have come here as migrants working in needed sectors, who are carers, working for the NHS, or have some of the highest levels of poverty in this country than other groups who have come here. So but they cannot access public funds. They're not allowed to. So if you're gonna, do essentially a new benefit system where everyone gets a basic level of income, you have to make sure everyone will get that basic level of income. So that would be the one thing I would do, as well as other structural changes to your economy so that people can choose to work, choose to volunteer, and choose to do what they want to do, because it's not like they're forced to go into a low-paid job with no progression and no control over their hours. So that's what I would do with UBI.
Thank you. Any other, if you need to hand it back? Yeah.
The only other point I think I would sort of say here, and it's not specific to any of the comments or the proposals, but I think when we're talking about benefits and access to things, we also have to be very mindful of things like dignity and how people feel when they are having to kind of tap into benefits or rock up a food bank for their food, or anything like that. So I think there's issues of stigma that we need to make sure that we break down with any benefit system in the future, just to make sure that people already under a lot of pressure don't have additional stressors that could further contribute to mental health. And I think this is also why, when we're looking at what needs to be done in the food system, we're looking at making sure healthy food is more affordable, so that when, on the other hand, we're talking about unhealthy food and how we need to reduce it, and how, the ultra processed food argument, for instance, at the moment is a good example of that. What we don't then want is to be adding more stress to people's lives, because we're talking about all these things they shouldn't do, but not giving them the support to actually do what's better. So I think we just have to kind of be mindful of that within the system and the solutions that we're looking towards.
Yeah. Do you want to? No, right. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thanks very much. It's really interesting to hear about the policy solution. Sorry, my name is Mattia from the National Education Union. I'm interested to hear about we've spoken a lot about support for low-income people. What about at the other end? Where are we taking this money from? I appreciate it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but it feels as though, particularly in the food sector, there's huge profits in sort of supermarket chains and things like that. Similarly with private renting, landlords are making, or were at least until very recently, making huge amounts of money. So yeah, I guess I'm interested in any comments you have about that kind of the inequality, not just the level of need. You see what I mean?
Okay.
What are we doing at the top?
Anybody want to comment on inequality?
I think the only point that I would make there is related to on the retail side. There is an investigation at the moment underway around the competition because of concerns of, I think, what's been called greedflation. I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be, but there was a parliamentary inquiry last week, and this other one that's being done. So there is kind of, I don't know what the word, I guess there's concern and recognition of this kind of, there's people struggling on the one hand and then profits being made on the other. But as I say, specifically with the retailers, there's no kind of conclusion to that discussion, but it is kind of happening in the background.
Yeah, so firstly, I sort of mentioned earlier, the importance of thinking about competition policy as part of your wider economic policy. I'll also just talk a little bit about inequality. And the fact is, although levels of income inequality in the UK are quite high, they haven't changed dramatically, in the last 20 years or so. But where you are starting to see, I think the problem is that combination of sustained low incomes and a lack of economic growth, combined with reductions in public services, that mean the situation feels particularly acute now. Where inequality has been growing is in wealth inequality. So that, leads you to consider sort of, are there, one option to explore is, thinking about how you might, whether or not you might sort of tax people's wealth. I mean, the council tax system is sort of completely ripe for reform, sort of based on housing values that were set in decades ago. And then additionally, you were mentioning private landlords, and at the moment, tax from different income sources or the tax you pay on different income sources is very, very different. So the taxes you pay on, the work, the earnings you get from being an employee are vastly different to those where if you're taking the majority of your income in dividends or even in rents as well. So there is quite a lot that can be done to equalize the tax rates you pay, that sort of ignore the source of income and just sort of tax at an equal level. So there was the Institute for Fiscal Studies have done an awful lot of work on that, and I direct you to their work there. And in addition, a couple of weeks ago, the Resolution Foundation also had a report on taxes.
Thank you. Katie, can I, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, eFutures is actually doing a lot of work on this. So one thing I'm looking at is incentives for raising currently young people on different minimum wage levels. So young people under a certain age earn nothing. Essentially, it's quite frankly, to me, it's embarrassing. It's kind of a disgrace that they earn so much less and they do the same amount of work as everyone else in their workplace. So I'm doing some economic modeling that looks at what tax receipts will go into the treasury if you actually bumped up the minimum wage for young people to living wage. Some young people get living wage if they're in an apprenticeship. They have a really good employer. So we're also doing some work with employers to look at them and say, you really should be raising your wages in a way that means your workers. It's almost like the Ford model from like the 1920s and et cetera. If you give your workers enough money to buy things, they'll buy your things. And therefore you'll have an increase in your overall profits are really good for you. So we're working with employers, but we're also doing some modeling for the treasury and the benefit. And so DWP, how much they save on benefits if they would uprate the minimum wage, as well as uprate the apprenticeship wage to either the living wage or above minimum wage. So that every young person earns the same wage essentially. And then also how much money the treasury can expect because of increased tax receipts, because these are young people starting. These are just, 18-year-olds. They have probably 50 years of working, which means 50 years of tax receipts coming into the treasury. So if you increase their wages now, it will continue to increase as they go forward in the treasury. You can expect more money to fund better interventions for helping those who are the furthest from the labor market. So I can only say watch this space because this is our idea and we're not sure how it will work yet.
Thank you very much. Katie, online.
Yeah, I've got possibly a difficult one here. Do the speakers and panelists believe that the current economic system based on the accumulation of profit actually meets the needs of the people? And will this solve the problems that we're facing?
Well, that's easy, isn't it? That one. Yeah.
Can I act like it don't work for eFutures for a minute?
Yeah, go on.
Like I don't work for eFutures for a minute. I think, no, eFutures, we do recognize the current economic system does not work. And that's why we're, all of the work we do is what we consider systems change. So we're working to improve the local systems, the youth employment system and the youth education system and the way it pairs up with getting young people into good work. So we could recognize it is not currently working. And we have that in data that there are certain groups that the system has not worked for a very long time. I think what I would say since they arrived on the shores of the UK once these groups were even formed in the UK. So I'm thinking even hundreds of years ago, the system has not worked for people, working class people, and also even young people from certain backgrounds. So you could recognize that this has been a longstanding problem for a long time. Our NEET rate has been consistently high for 25 years. So other policy interventions, other things going on, 25 years, we've had one of the highest NEET rates, of course, bar Italy and Spain and Greece in the OECD. So it's a consistent problem where somehow the system is not distributing in a way that fits everyone. So I think we can definitely recognize there's a serious problem, even if I can't say how I would fix it personally versus what Andrea, work person, would fix it in front of a crowd of people.
Okay. Anybody else want to have a go at the entire economic system?
I was going to answer it a sub question, which is more about the economics of the food system, which is that fundamentally we have a system that makes unhealthy food cheap. And there is incentives for companies to promote those unhealthy foods because that is where the profit is going to be made. And fundamentally, that is a challenge to overcome when we're talking about healthy diets. You can't get away from the fact that it is just more profitable to sell more chocolate, crisps, confectionery, snacks, etc., than it is to sell fresh whole food. And that's kind of linked to the economic system more broadly. It is broken in that sense.
And then come back. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'll go back at Stuart's point much earlier, GDP. I'm going to be theological for a moment. We have bowed down to the god Mammon in Old Testament terms for far too long. We try to measure everything in economics, and that means we devalue huge amounts of people. And I'll be very personal about this. My wife has not had paid employment for many, many years, but she volunteers in all kinds of ways. She stands alongside people. She helps at food banks. She, and so on. And none of that is counted as any contribution to society at present. So I'm actually quite disturbed in some ways. You have to do it in these reports about, you can now do an economic well-being factor. The trouble is that's almost still bowing back down to the god of economics, because you've got to prove it economically. So somewhere we have to revalue people and people's contributions, not just in what they earn and what they pay.
Yeah. So not funded by the Nuffield Foundation, but sort of Gus O'Donnell is doing some great work on the value of, and a sort of wider team doing some great work on the value of sort of the volunteering sector of the economy, and the value of the third sector, and the value of charities, all of which I think we would say in sort of monetary terms do not get valued. I'm not going to sort of I'm going to sort of slightly sidestep the really tricky question that was actually asked, and sort of respond to sort of Hannah's point, which was about sort of regulation. There are lots of aspects of the food supply chain that don't work and that are broken. And I wondered, well, is regulation the answer to all of that? But we can see currently, particularly with the water system, how aspects of the regulatory system are broken. So if regulation's the answer, you'd also need to be able to do regulation very well. And I'm also going to sort of just focus briefly on other ways in which the current system might be broken. We've talked a little bit about place today, but not really in any great detail. But you've got huge levels of geographical inequalities measured in a variety of ways, and we've got a system in which the way that funding is allocated to local services is completely unrelated to need. So spending in areas with greater need, for example, on police, social care, public health, local government, has fallen further and faster than spending in affluent areas. So there are also, the way in which both central and local government make choices about how the tax revenues that they collect are distributed, and there are certainly ways in which that could be done more fairly.
Thanks very much. I'm going to draw things to a close. I just pick up the point about, because I mentioned the point about GDP. Gus O'Donnell gave a brilliant speech at annual conference of NCBO, which I had the privilege to lead for 25 years, where he wowed the audience by saying drug dealing is included in GDP measures, volunteering isn't. There's something fundamentally wrong with the way we're measuring success and growth. Can I just draw it to a close? There's plenty of opportunities now for further networking. I can see some strange looking breadsticks at the back there, which I'm no doubt you can feast on. And there's some juices and stuff, I think, at the back. There's plenty of opportunities for networking, including a rather amazing terrace that you could network on, which would be great. Can I close? Thank you for all the questions that you've asked and the observations that you've made. I want to thank the NatSen staff who are here and who've made this possible, both in terms of the activities during the conference, but also helping people to respond online. So thank you very much to them. But most of all, can I thank the panel for your contribution? I think it's been an outstanding one. So thank you all very much. Can we thank them in the normal way? Thank you. Please help yourself to odd-looking breadsticks at the back.